Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we are not in the business of censoring each other's questions to nominees or falsely assigning motives that don't exist. There is no religious test for nominees on this committee, and to suggest otherwise is, to quote my friend from Utah, wildly inappropriate. I'm glad that we agree that it is a perfectly legitimate inquiry by members of this committee to ask whether a nominee's religious views can be set aside for judicial objectivity. So there's agreement on that. Getting to the nominees before us today. I spoke last week to explain my reasons for opposing the nomination of William Barr to be Donald Trump's Attorney General. And this week I'd like to focus on some of the 44 nominees on this markup agenda that are part of this administration's effort to pack our federal courts with ideologically driven nominees. Who gets on the federal courts for life is high stakes. Just ask the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, who have spent decades and lots of money placing people who are on their ideological page on our federal courts. That the vast majority, over 80% of Trump's nominees are members of the Federalist Society is no accident. More than 80% of the nominees that this committee has dealt with are members of the Federalist Society, and yet, less than 4% of all American lawyers are Federalist Society members.
Exciting.
Court packing is proceeding apace. Too many of these nominees have spent their careers opposing the rights of women, minorities, the LGBTQ community, and Americans who need affordable health care. Many of the nominees have not provided the kind of assurances necessary to reassure the country that they can separate their personal views and ideology from the responsibility to be fair and impartial. And just sitting here saying to us, we will follow the law, we will follow Supreme Court precedent, that is what they all say. That is not the kind of reassurance that suffices, in my view, to ensure that they can set aside their very strongly held views as they decide cases before them. And some of the most controversial judicial nominees from the last Congress are back on the agenda. I'd like to mention my objections to some of them to illustrate my opposition to so many of these nominees. Wendy Vitter, nominated to the Eastern District of Louisiana. She promoted outrageous conspiracy theories that abortion causes breast cancer and birth control pills make, and to quote her, choose partners who share a similar genetic profile, causing them to lose interest in sex and become more likely to be the victims of violent assault and murder, end quote. That is one of the most outrageous kinds of beliefs to try and perpetrate, but she did so. Kenneth Bell for the Western District of North Carolina. Mr. Bell has taken extreme views on a topic that may come before him where he will have to decide without prejudgment. In a letter to the editor in a local paper, he criticized an article defending abortion, which, by the way, is protected by the United States Constitution, stating, quote, either the unborn is a mass of cells worthy of no more consideration than a hangnail, or it is a child which may not be killed. There is no middle ground, end quote. Carl Nichols for the District of Columbia. Mr. Nichols defended pharmacies seeking to use religious objections to avoid dispensing emergency contraception, not a position showing any understanding of the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution under Supreme Court precedent. Michael Troncalli of the Eastern District of Texas is an ideological activist against voting rights, abortion, and immigration. He gave public speeches using the widely debunked myth of in-person voter fraud to justify Texas's draconian voter ID laws. Mr. Troncalli accused Wendy Davis, the former Democratic candidate for governor of Texas, of wanting, quoting, quote, him, to kill babies 5 months into term, end quote, and asserted that her, quote, claim to fame is that she, quote, kills little girls. Mr. Troncalli also displayed a shocking and simplistic view of poverty and a disturbing lack of compassion for the poor. He suggested that poverty is a mindset. Poverty is a mindset, as though poor people, it's all in their minds that they want to be in that position. And he wrote that American society has changed from self-reliant to a society of leeches, dependents who are looking for handouts. As a person who grew up in what I would deem poverty, I certainly was not a leech looking for handouts. Chad Wheeler, for the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. As a political appointee in Donald Trump's Justice Department, he has defended many of this president's most disturbing policies, including the inhumane separation of families at the border and use of the courts to dismantle the Affordable Care Act's protections of those with pre-existing conditions. Patrick Wyrick, who is a 37-year-old nominee for the Western District of Oklahoma. Mr. Wyrick has spent his short legal career trying to undermine environmental protections, women's reproductive rights, workers' rights, and Native American sovereignty. When he defended Oklahoma's controversial death penalty by lethal injection in the Supreme Court, Justice Sotomayor called him out for his misstatements of fact. And during oral argument, Justice Sotomayor told him, quote, "I am substantially disturbed that in your brief you made factual statements that were not supported by the cited of those sources and, in fact, directly contradicted. So nothing you say or read to me am I going to believe, frankly, until I see it with my own eyes." The context. We should not have a judge who doesn't state facts accurately before the United States Supreme Court, no less. Nor should we have judges who come with firm personal views about issues they may have to rule fairly on. Matthew Kaczmarek for the Northern District of Texas. As Deputy Attorney Counsel for the First Liberty Institute, Mr. Kaczmarek has devoted his working life to making sure that his clients are free to discriminate while hiding under the guise of advocating for religious freedom. He urged the Supreme Court in Obergefell v. Hodges to rule that there is no nationwide right to same-sex marriage. Mr. Kaczmarek argued for employers who objected on religious grounds to providing contraceptive coverage as part of the health care required under the ACA. He complained in an interview about the, quote, imposition of a secular judgment on an essentially sacred question, end quote, in the contraceptive mandate case, forgetting entirely to mention that the use of contraception is constitutionally protected, as I noted, by previous Supreme Court decisions. Mr. Kaczmarek also urged the Supreme Court to allow a Virginia school board to require students to use the restroom corresponding to their biological genders, and a state labor and industry board on Oregon to let a bakery refuse to make same-sex wedding cakes. It seems there is no right sought by women or LGBTQ people that Mr. Kaczmarek won't trample in the name of religious freedom. All of these nominees are before us today. They represent different parts of the profile of a Trump nominee. Those who get the stamp of approval from the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. Month after month, we have seen a parade of these so-called conservative activists nominated to the federal courts. And I'm very glad that Senator Whitehouse talked about why these nominees are, in fact, not conservative. So we are confronted with a mostly homogeneous group. In many ways, not much diversity with the Trump nominees. They have been groomed by conservative political ideologues. They want to see Roe v. Wade overturned or narrowed into oblivion. LGBT people permanently consigned to the margins of American life, and constitutional and civil rights encroached on by the religious preference of a vocal few. These are not the kind of judges that will protect and promote independence and integrity of the courts, and today I will be voting no on them and others. And Mr. Chairman, before I end my remarks, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter a letter into the record regarding Matthew Kaczmarek's nomination.
Without objection.
I discussed earlier, thank you. It is a letter signed by 300 parents of transgender children opposing his nomination, and in their letter, these parents point to Mr. Kaczmarek's prior statements that, quote, gender identity doesn't exist and that being transgender is a delusion. And these parents write, Kaczmarek's words are deeply offensive and harmful. Our children are not a delusion, and neither is our love and support for them. We believe our children are miracles, like every child.